Hello, welcome. This is a webinar, Student's Guide to Law and Neuroscience. We'll cover some AI and a few other things along the way. Welcome. I will do one thing, which is make my screen visible so that you can see my slides. And you'll have to let me know via the chat here in just a second if you can't see them. But hold on one moment. Here we go. I'm going to share my screen, and now you should be able to see both me and some slides here. So, one procedural point. I can't hear you. I won't be able to hear you, but I will be able to listen, or I should say read, your questions if you type them. You can type them in. I'll either answer in real time or probably at the end I will check out to see what's going on, but that is where you should put, if for any reason, I'll pull them up here, the question and answer. If, again, for any reason you can't hear me, let me know. I don't see anyone asking a question yet, such as, I can't hear you, what am I doing wrong? So that means I think we're in pretty good shape. So what my plan is today is to walk you through, at least what I see as some of the paths to careers in law and neuroscience. Again, broadly defined, so lots of areas of law and lots of areas of neuroscience, and including things like artificial intelligence and related fields. All right, so let's get going. So a little bit of context here that I think is useful. So we're going to put this bar out of the way so you can see a little bit better. This is building a career in law and neuroscience, and I start here because before we get into any detail, you've got to have some sense of sort of how you want to build your career. You know, eventually it will end, hopefully, in a job, a meaningful career. But let's start at the bottom of this pyramid, down here at the bottom. This is not a question that I can answer for you, but it is a question that you should be thinking about. And if you're here, it means you probably already are. What do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do when you grow up? And the reason that that's going to be really important, as you'll see a little bit later in the presentation, is that even though law and neuroscience or law and AI or law and biology are interdisciplinary fields, meaning you get to choose to do a couple of different things, you can't do everything. And you can't really do both full time. The laws of physics and biology don't allow us to be in two places at the same time. So you are going to have to make some choices along the way, and those can be difficult choices. And we'll get to that in a second. But at some point, you'll come up and figure out, all right, here's what I want to do. All right, once you figure that out, and actually I'm going to kind of make a caveat there, we'll come back to it in a second. It doesn't exactly work in this linear fashion, but let's pretend for a moment it does, and then we'll break that illusion. You've got to create some skill set that you have, some education. And that's usually a combination of these next two levels. The schooling that you're doing, whether you're in school or recently finished or thinking about more, and then the training, the experience, the network you build. And some of the questions we'll talk about here tonight are, what types of courses might you want to take, and what sorts of skills should you be developing? And then that next level up, how do you actually get started? So maybe you're sitting there, one of the questions that's come in is, I'm in a school that doesn't really have too much going on at this intersection, but I'm kind of interested in it. What do I do? And we'll try and answer that question too. I just put these other two top things up there because some of you are already in that position, or you may be soon, which is maybe you figured out what it is you want to be, and maybe you think you've done enough, or at least some of enough, what's enough to get ready to apply to a job. And then you want to figure out, all right, well, how do I actually do it? And we won't get into too much of the nuts and bolts of applying, but I might say a few things. And if you have specific questions, we can address those at the end. And then, of course, there's this thing at the top, which is ultimately finding a career that's meaningful at some place at the intersection of law and science, that gives you the right work-life balance, that can, and then, crucially, can actually pay off those student loans and everything else you need. All right, I'll check the questions and answers periodically. There's nothing there. Let's continue. Now, again, as I said, sort of in the fantasy world, it sort of goes like this. You can see the arrows here on the screen. You figure out what it is you want to do, and then you have the requisite skills, and then you get the right internship and the right job, and then you apply, and then you get your job. But in the real world, it doesn't usually work like that. And in particular, there's one part of this pyramid that's really misleading. This was the illusion that I mentioned earlier. And it has to do with actually this bottom rung, because it's really difficult to know what you want to do if you've never had any experience doing it. It's a little bit like going and picking your college. I think we have mostly college or college graduates here. Maybe some are still in high school. In any event, trying to choose a college is really difficult, especially choosing between some, because you don't know exactly what it's like when you're there, what it's going to be like. And you don't get to run the experiment multiple times. You don't get to try one for 4 years and then come back and try another. So the challenge is, again, this question of what do you do? And here's the challenge, as I mentioned before, even if you're interested in everything, you can't do everything. So you're going to have to make some hard choices. And right now, you don't have to make those choices yet, but I just want to preview that you're going to have to at some point. You just can't do everything. You can continue to be interested in everything. That's fine. You can listen to podcasts about everything. You can casually read over your weekends books about anything you want. But as a career, you cannot do everything. So you're going to have to make some choices. For instance, do you want to be a practicing attorney? And if so, you have to make more choices. What areas? Do you want to be a professor? And if so, what discipline? Do you want to be a researcher? If so, what field, basic or clinical or applied? Do you want to be a clinician working with patients? And if so, what patient population? Do you want to be a policymaker? And if so, what area, or both geographic and policy, and so on and so forth. So you have to answer these questions. As I just said, it's tough to figure that out until you kind of get into these levels of the pyramid. It is, you kind of need an internship where you need to take a few classes to figure out if you like AI. You have to take a few classes or do a little research to figure out if you like working with rats in the lab, or you don't, right? And so the reason it becomes, I think, challenging is, how do you get started in a field where you're not even sure, like before that, I don't even know if it's the field I want to do. And it's the classic sort of catch-22, the jobs you want, they say, we don't want anyone without experience. Well, how are you going to get experience if you don't get a chance to get the job, right? So we'll try and come up with some strategies for dealing with that. But these are the general challenges that are faced. And again, it's something that we'll work through, talk a little bit about. All right, so here's my plan for the night. Again, hit your question and answers and let me know, one, if any of the technical issues arise. I don't think they will, but if they do, let me know. And two, if you have substantive questions about any of this. We will post this at the end, so you can go back and look at it if you missed something or you want to share it. And I can, answer questions afterwards, but I'd really love to do it in real time and at the end. Here's our plan. All right, I'll take a little bit of time to talk about these first two things, which are a general introduction to neuroscience and law. And I think some of it applies more generally to neuroscience and related fields like AI. And the first question to ask is this even a fruitful career choice? Is it worth pursuing? I can't answer that question for you, but I can answer it for me. And I'll tell you at least why my answer has been a very enthusiastic yes. Then I will give just the tiniest little snapshot of what neuroscience, AI, and law look like. I don't have time to do more. I mean, I teach an entire semester's worth of classes on both separately those topics. So we won't try and cram 50 hours into 5 minutes, but I'll just give you a sense of what it looks like, really with an eye towards careers. And then we'll get to these last two items, which is, I think, probably the most useful for tonight. How do you get from here, wherever you are, to there, wherever it is you decide you want to go? We'll talk and share some resources where you can look for more information. And then, as I mentioned, time at the end to answer your question. Okay, so what about this whole neuroscience law thing? Is it useful? And I start with a picture of my brain that's from 2009 on the campus of UC Santa Barbara, something called Brain Camp I was participating in. And I start there because it really begs the question, why law and neuroscience? Why this field of neural law? And there are a lot of ways to answer that question. The basic idea is that law is in the business and policy is in the business of governing human relationships. And if any discipline, whether it's economics or philosophy or English or now neuroscience, can help law figure out why it is that people do the things they do, think the way they think, why some of us and our friends sometimes do or don't think or act the way we wish they would, then maybe law can do its job better through better understanding better laws, the basic idea. It was captured well in a old book by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., one of America's great Supreme Court justices, though as a footnote also had one of, actually in the area of bioethics, the most criticized decisions, but at least in this book, I think had a really nice idea. And he asked, why have precedent? I mean, we have to follow in 2019 what we did in 2018 in law and so forth. And it said it's revolting to have no better reason for a rule of law than it was so laid down at the time of Henry IV. Meaning, just because we've always been doing something the same way, or just because we've always thought a certain thing about why humans do what they do or why they act, maybe that's not a good enough reason. He went on to say it's still more revolting if the grounds upon which it was laid down, that is, that the assumptions that law has have vanished long ago. And neuroscience is particularly interesting because it's one of the fields that is really challenging some of law's core assumptions, and how to figure that out is part of what this field is doing. Just a brief introduction to my own work. I'm not going to talk hardly at all actually about my own work tonight, but I do run a lab here at the University of Minnesota and at Mass General Hospital called the Shen Neuro Law Lab. Our motto, every story is a brain story, and I think that's very much true. The challenge is that every story right now is also a poorly understood brain story. As one neuroscientist says, if understanding the brain is like running a marathon, we've come 3 inches, and that's probably true. So one of the challenges for law and for finding your career in law and neuroscience is, all right, yeah, we know the brain's really important, but do we know enough to actually make a difference in a particular area of law or policy? An analogous question can be raised for AI. Yes, we know there are rapid developments. Yes, we know the future will look very different, but how different, in what ways, and on what timeline? And depending on getting that answer right, you need to get that answer right in order to pick your sort of career path right. All right, what do we do in my lab? We do empirical research. I want to point out that I work with lots of students all the time. This webinar is important to me. The work that I do in mentoring is important to me. We do outreach and policy in the legislature and elsewhere. We've got lots and lots of research projects. I won't talk about them. I will just mention that amongst the things I teach are courses in law and neuroscience and law and artificial intelligence. And there are more and more of those courses popping up, but they're not the norm, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. I want to flag 2 other organizations that I'm involved with. I'll mention these at the end for more resources as well. One is the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Law and Neuroscience, based at Vanderbilt Law School, directed by Professor Owen Jones, and brought together neuroscientists and legal scholars and philosophers and judges from across the nation, trying to work through some of these issues. LawNeuro.org. One of the things I do there is direct the education and outreach program, and we've done a lot of programs for judges and for attorneys, really trying to integrate neuroscience into the fabric of the justice system. The other center, and the sponsor of tonight's webinar, is the MGH Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, clbb.org or clbb.mgh.harvard.edu. I am executive director of this center and really excited about the work that we're doing. I'll say a little bit about it, but again, this isn't primarily about the center, it's primarily about your path. But we'll come back to that work in a bit. The focus of our center, the big idea, is kind of what I mentioned before. Better decisions aligned with science, we think, will produce better outcomes aligned with justice. But exactly how to align decisions with science and exactly how to integrate and to provide actionable, accurate neuroscience tools to the legal profession is a challenging thing, and we spend our time trying to do that. All right, so that's a little bit about me and the reason that I think that neuroscience and law is not just a fascinating thing to think about and work on, but a practical tool for improving a number of areas of law and policy. All right, what does it actually look like in practice? And let me double check here to see if we've got questions. There are none. Okay, not yet, so that's fine. All right, so what does it look like? Let me just again give you a snapshot. So this is a course book that with my colleagues at Vanderbilt we've written, Law and Neuroscience. And I just mention it because I want to point out 3 things. Almost 90% of the publications in this book were only published since 2000. This is a really new field, almost 2/3 just between 2008 and 2013. And we are already putting together a 2nd edition. And I can tell you that a lot of the work has happened since 2014. So we'll see in a little bit that you have both the opportunity and challenge of swimming in really new uncharted waters. Again, for me, it's awesome and exciting. But if you want the comfort of a well-established field, you should drop off the webinar now and do something like investment banking or management consulting. places where you know, tried and true, what you're going to get. They've been around for a long time. Law and Neuroscience is the great frontier, one of the great frontiers. All right, but it is showing up all over the place in some really neat ways. And I just want to give you one headline just from the last 30 days. I could give you many, many more, but here's just one. This was the horrific tragedy from 2 years ago, timely today in a different way, but these were race-related protests and then violence in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, when the offender, 20 years old at the time, drove his car into this crowd of people, killing one victim. A picture of the victim and the assailant. The sentencing was done just last month. And what I want to point out is that the primary argument from the defense in their sentencing memorandum was grounded in neuroscience. Now, there's probably some critique to make about whether or not contemporary neuroscience proves that because he was only 20, that he doesn't deserve a life sentence because it's cruel and unusual under the Constitution. But I just want to point out that it is the front and center argument in one of the major issues and major cases of our time. And in particular, they noted, these are the lawyers, not the scientists, noted that one reason is the advent of functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. Brain imaging make an appearance in just really at the center stage of law. Now, the prosecution responded, and probably appropriately, that look, the defendant Field's actions, they said, don't fit into this paradigm about brain development. But whether it did and whether it didn't, and setting aside the specific of that case, the point is that neuroscience is here. About a decade ago, even 2 decades ago, whether or not neuroscience was going to show up in the law was really speculative. You had, little wall magnets like that. My brain tumor made me do it, and questions about, did my neurons make me do it? But we've moved from contemplation about, what if neuroscience showed up in the law, to action. And as one headline just from last year noted, my brain made me do it is becoming a more common criminal defense. Now, I'll point out that it's not just in criminal law, and this is really important as you think about your careers. Let me give you just a host of ways that have very little to do with criminal law, but have lots to do with neuroscience and law. Here is just in rapid fire. Maybe you're interested in the regulation of new technologies. Did you know that there are all sorts of do-it-yourself and direct-to-consumer brain technologies? Well, who regulates those? Food and Drug Administration, Federal Trade Commission, lawyers involved? You betcha. What about regulation of the actual research and clinical trials? There are now brain implants being used in all sorts of ways. What if after the research, 5 years of the research, what are you going to do with that device that's now implanted in your research participant? Not as easy as drugs where you just stop taking the drugs. Ethics and law directly involved. Immigration law, we're involved in this work with the Center for Law, Brain and Behavior in refugee asylum and cases, and also separation and trauma at the border issues and worldwide issue. What about aging brain, dementia in the law, when your grandparents or your parents as they age have to deal with wills and trust and estates and contested wills? Law is very much involved. There's lots of crossover with other fields. We won't have time to talk about it all, but you should just know that. Law and biology, law and genetics, law and AI. What about environmental law and food law? Also very much brain science when you're thinking about the effect of various toxins on the brain. Health law, there's sorts of questions about brain screening. Animal law. When do animals have rights? There's a best-selling book about dog brains, and there are questions about regulation of human-animal chimera research. I'm involved in some of that. All sorts of privacy law as we gain more and more ability via technology to extract brain data. How should the law protect brain privacy? What do we do with brain biomarkers? That is, someone seems fine and looks fine and feels fine, but we do a variety of blood and brain tests, and we suggest that maybe they're not so fine. Evidence law, how do we introduce scientific evidence in the courtroom? Insurance law, should you get the same type of coverage for depression as you do for a broken femur? Copyright law, revisiting trademark doctrine, disability, social security law, and the neuroscience pain. It goes on and on. Tort law is maybe the place where neuroscience and law collide the most at present in brain injury cases and malpractice and mass torts. Education law, there's an entire field of educational neuroscience, mind, brain, and education, issues of special education, all sorts of constitutional law questions. The front lines, for instance, of litigation around abortion have to do with fetal pain, and those cases very much engage with neuroscience. So much out there, contract law, capacity to contract, and there are many, many opportunities potentially for getting involved in this both as a career and initially through research and through experience. I want to make a parallel claim about law and artificial intelligence, noting the time I cannot go into this, but I did give a link here, and we'll share the slides afterwards as well. The link is to an entire multi-page syllabus with lots of links. Law and AI is here. There are now firms, big law firms, prominent firms, and they've come to talk to my class, that have entire divisions just on law and AI. This again is no longer a what if science fiction question. This is very much a what do we do in terms of liability for self-learning machines? How do we respond at legal and policy level to disruptions in the labor market from increasing use of mechanization and automation? What about the use of AI in medicine and in law, robot rights, intellectual property, the weaponization of AI? How do we govern robots, autonomous vehicles? There are AI-based algorithms in virtually every aspect of life. How do we handle that? There are things like sex bots. I've written on that. I'll just, as an aside, as sort of a fun aside, when you write on some of these issues, and I don't control the headlines, you get headlines like this. This was one of the pieces I wrote. I did not choose the headline. Experts worry humanoid lovers could crush human limbs or be used as tools for government spying. I didn't say that exactly, but I did make the point that we have no really governance prepared for these sorts of things. Just one other tidbit about what I do from earlier this year. And how quickly the technology is changing. This is a picture that a colleague of mine here at Minnesota is developing, portable MRI. Right now, in order to get a brain scan, PET scan, MRI, you have to go to the research facility or to the hospital. Well, the future is that the scanner will come to you. You don't have to go to the scanner. This raises a host of possibilities, but also a host of legal and ethical questions, and it's fun to be right there in the middle. All right, so snapshot. It looked like maybe there was a question that came in, so let me take a look. Joining from Australia, Australian legal community. I will get to that. The answer is actually yes. There is an international community, and I should have noted that. So it's a great question. In that snapshot, that was mostly a domestic U.S. snapshot, but only because of time constraints. There are active investigators in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Brazil, China, India, engaging in varieties of neuroscience and law, AI and law work, and increasingly some of the ethical questions concern international and global governance. So let me come back to that, but it's a great point, and I should have mentioned it, that there really is an international dimension to this. The international questions are challenging. Here's a challenge about neuroscience and law. The neuroscience is by and large the neuroscience. That is, the way that an axon works in India is the same way that an axon works here in Boston or Minnesota. But the law and the regulatory space around research and clinical practice and justice system and liability can be completely different. That's, again, a question about career paths. Are you going to be a lawyer who understands the law in one country or another? Are you going to try and do international work? So we'll maybe get back to that. But that's a great question, and I appreciate you're asking it. Let me see if there are more. I may table them for the end. Policy angle, career, effects, regulation, neurotech. Yeah, let's talk about the policy stuff too. Let me get that at the end, and we'll come to that in a second, because it is a different set of questions. I'm involved with it a little bit, and colleagues are involved extensively, and we'll come back to it. All right, so how do you get from here to there? Let me give some general and specific advice. So first, some particular paths, and here maybe we can talk a little bit about the policy angle. Now, there are a lot of ways to do law and neuroscience. There's no, and again, law and AI, law and science. There's no particular one right way. There are lots of, there's different flavors. This goes back to the point I made at the beginning. You kind of have to feel out what you want to do. So I'm just going to go through these. They're not in order of importance or a frequency. They're simply in the order that kind of makes sense for me, I think, to speak about them. But I will point out here, and I made the point earlier, that you really have to choose one. And I'm going to make this point in a moment. So you could be a neuro or a science AI-informed attorney. That is, you have a JD, maybe you have a PhD, an MD, or a master's. You don't need it. And what are your primary responsibilities? Well, you're going to be working with clients. You're an attorney, and you might be working, this could be a criminal defense attorney, and you have your own shop, but your work is informed. by neuroscience. Your sentencing work is informed. It could be working for the largest law firm in the country doing insurance defense work against class action lawsuits related to toxins that your client developed. Who knows? The point is that you're an attorney and you're leveraging your knowledge of science to be a better attorney for your clients. You could be a law professor. That's what I do. It's required a JD and maybe a PhD or an MD or master's. We have a lot of joint degrees. I happen to be a joint degree. What do you do in my space? You do a couple of things. Primarily, you do a lot of, well, of course, you do a lot of teaching, but you do a lot of research and writing, really trying to be an idea generator. When you're an attorney, you are beholden, as you should be, to your clients. As a law professor, we have the freedom to be thinking, and many professors do, the freedom to ask our own questions. You really work with a lot of different folks, from researchers, practicing attorneys, judges, and you can do a lot of policy work as well. To get to the policy question, one way to do it is through the academic lens. So a lot of professors, and this could be law or a policy professor, you can do a public policy school, political science, a few other places, and your work could be on the regulatory side. That is, how to do policy, whether to be a person enacting the policy or a person thinking about what should the policy be, or policy evaluation, are all related but usually distinct, distinct paths. And you don't have to do one your entire career, but you can kind of switch around, and they're usually working in close engagement. That is, FDA. So in the neuroscience world, your big regulatory agencies at the federal level are FDA, some FTC, if you're doing educational neuroscience, Department of Ed. And then at the state level, you've got a lot of other potential, like health and human services, if you're working in those fields, criminal justice, if you're working in the criminal law field. But you're trying to think about, how do we, for instance, handle the opioid epidemic and respond to it appropriately? Well, that's public health. You could be in a public health world, thinking a lot about, in order to do our policy, we need to understand substance use disorder and how it might vary across these different parts of our community, our state, or our county. So I think the policy answer is, how do you get involved in policy work? You can do it through a lot of these lenses, but again, one's not better than the other, but you've got a lot of options. And I should have put in here, to make it more explicit, master's could be MPP, the PhD could be in public policy. But again, sort of neuro-informed, that is, you have background in that, even if you don't have a full, master's or MD or PhD. All right, flipping to the other side, maybe you want to do neuroscience research. You want to be a research professor who spends your time getting awesome NIH grants to study the underlying mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease, try and find a cure, or to find better ways of identifying and treating traumatic brain injury. Okay. You're going to get a PhD in your respective field, and those fields really can vary. So neuroscience is also a broad field. Neurosciences come from physics, biology, psychology, and brain science and cognitive science. So they come from a lot of different places. You'd likely be in a university setting if you're doing research. That next line is about private settings. I'll get to that. And you could then focus on some legally relevant area and become involved either directly or indirectly in legal work. And examples of this are neuroscientists like B.J. Casey at Yale, very prominent neuroscientist who studies adolescent development and adolescent decision-making and risk, reward trade-offs, and her work has been cited in multiple legal cases, and she's been very engaged, for instance, in that MacArthur project I mentioned before, and many others like her in other labs. You could also work at a private firm. So many PhDs across a variety of sciences don't go into university settings and academic settings, but go into industry settings. And there too, you could be doing work that's very relevant. For instance, here in Minnesota, one of the largest medical device companies in the world many of them are located here. One is called Medtronic, and they for decades have been doing brain stimulation work to treat Parkinson's and depression. And their lead researchers are also cognizant of the legal and ethical challenges they face, and they try and handle those in-house. You could be an expert witness, that is an MD or a PhD, and even a JD to some extent, but usually MD or PhD, who participates very directly in trials by testifying as an expert on any variety of cases. This could be an expert on the effect of some pesticide on brain development, or the forensic assessment of someone who's been accused of committing a crime, or an assessment of someone's brain injury and assessing damages. But someone's very directly involved. You could be a forensic psychologist or neuropsychologist where you're doing psychological evaluations. And you're seeing patients in relevant or clinically relevant context, legally relevant context. You could be an MD doing similar work as a psychiatrist, neurologist, neuropsychiatrist in related fields. And again, you might work either directly or fairly directly, very directly or maybe more indirectly with practicing attorneys, or they may just sort of send you to do your evaluations. And the final, and this isn't a universe, by the way, of all things, it's just a lot of the possible paths. Entrepreneur, and I want to emphasize that too. When you're in a field as new as this, there are a lot of individuals who just sort of get up and do their own thing, and you should think about doing that. And there are many examples. I just gave one, which is maybe you're the person who's going to create the next great startup company that says, you know what, I've looked at law and some of its inefficiencies and some of the help it needs, and I've got insight from neuroscience or AI or genetics or some field that's going to really help attorneys do a better job, or the legal system do a better job, or policymakers do a better job. Great. And there are a lot of entrepreneurs. For instance, I teach a course on sports concussions, and I can tell you there are many startup companies trying to provide better equipment and better monitoring and detecting devices for sports concussions. And I think that's a good thing. And those entrepreneurs come from all fields, business, engineering. They might have some of these credentials, they might not, but what they have is, sort of really interesting set of ideas. Let me pick up the questions and then we'll move forward. Same two, and we'll come back to those. We hit on some of it there. Now, how do you get to some of this stuff? There's one thing you absolutely need, and this is a general comment, you certainly need it here, is you need mentoring. It's been said, I don't know who to attribute the quote to, it's one of these sort of quotes you see on the web, but I've liked it before and I'll quote it here without attribution. Getting a mentor is the shortcut to success. I don't know that exactly the shortcut to success, but it's absolutely critical for the reasons kind of pictured in this diagram. But especially because when you're in a field that does not have a well-defined, just get on the treadmill and keep going, because here's how you become, a teacher, an engineer, as I said, a consultant, etc. If you're going to venture into a field that is so new that 90% of the material has only showed up in the last 20 years and almost 2/3 of it just in the last 6 or 7 years, you're going to need some mentoring for getting through that, right? This is uncharted territory. So I would ask you now, who are your mentors? I would make a high priority sort of trying to find a mentor, at least one, and maybe more than one if you can find them. But they're going to become so important to you in so many ways. Looking back, it is the thing that I didn't appreciate going into it that I do now. Is just the value of mentors. And my mentors are still my mentors. I turn to them all the time. So I would recommend that highly. Now, 7 things quickly that never hurt and almost always help, and then we'll get into the specifics about law and neuroscience. But these really matter a lot. I do a lot of hiring and a lot of reviewing of resumes and the like. And these things just matter so much. So general skill development, writing, communication, professionalism, following up. It's just hard to overestimate how much number one matters over and above everything else. You should get smarter. That means taking the right classes. That means working hard. I mean, it's actually a skill that you can develop. It's hard to measure. And, from a brain science perspective, it's impossible for us to take any biomarker data and determine how smart you are. So we can't put you into a combine. This becomes an issue, actually. So in the NFL, the NBA, they have a combine. And they're able to measure skills that translate well into the game that these individuals are playing, right? They take the height and the weight in a 40-yard dash. Well, the metrics here are a little tougher to measure. So one of them, which I mentioned next, is doing well on standardized tests. The reason this matters is indirect, because those standardized tests are a gateway for a variety of reasons, which I don't have time to talk about, but a really important part of the gateway into a lot of graduate programs. And that goes to number 5. And number 4 also contributes. So you want awesome grades, because 3 and 4 add up to getting into the strongest programs you can. That's both at the undergrad level and then especially at the graduate level. Why do you want to get into a really good graduate program? Because it's both the substance and signal. The substance is that, just remember the last class that you were in, when you were surrounded by people who, and I'll be very frank about it, weren't up to par to your cognitive abilities. It is, you were the star of the class, and you were bored a lot of the time, and you weren't challenged, and you started to maybe not even have to prepare for the class, and you need to get an A, okay? Then think about when you were in class, or even just around a table with your smartest friends, your smartest professors, and you were just totally engaged, and they were challenging you. and you realized that you had to step up your game. You had to think more carefully. You had to write better. You knew you couldn't get away with just kind of faking it. All right. So that's the substance of why you want a strong program. You want to be surrounded by peers who are working just as hard and who are just as talented as you are. There's also a signaling involved. As I said, because we don't have these biomarkers and combine of success, one of the things that's going to be sort of immediately signaled, and it's sort of immediate, is where did you get your degrees? Who did you work with? Who were your mentors? And how strong were they? As a proxy for trying to figure, and maybe, sometimes not a great proxy, but a proxy that's used nevertheless for your own talent. So affiliate and try and get in the strongest programs you can. I know, easier said than done, but we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, showing up in networking, very, very important. And maybe the thing that on this list is not something that you've done as much of. What does that mean? It means what it says. So show up, actually show up to events, physically go to places, and we'll talk about, in a moment what that means. And then networking means, I always think about it, shaking hands. You have not networked if you have not shaken a hand. So let's say that you're on campus and a really awesome neuroscientist or law professor or just someone who's written a neat book is going to show up and give a talk. And you go to the talk and you think, this is great, I learned a lot. Go up after or before the event, shake that person's hand and boldly ask, won't take much, would it be okay if I ever followed up with an email? Would it be okay if I met with you sometime? Actually shake a hand. You'd be surprised how much that matters. And showing up matters too. So here's what I mean by showing up. You can't do this all the time because you have limited resources, but look for several of the relevant conferences. So in this world, you want to think about the International Neuroethics Society. We meet in Chicago this year. You want to think about the Society for Neuroscience, also in Chicago. Those two are combined. You want to look at, if you're in the DC area, you want to look at NIH. If you're in the Boston area, you want to look at Harvard and MIT and BU and BC and Northeastern and the host of schools. Wherever your school is located, you want to look for those events. Now, one question that came in, and I've got it at the end, but I'll mention it now, was what do I do if my school doesn't seem to have these events or my area doesn't have these events? All right, that's a little more challenging, admitted, but a lot of this stuff is online. So you can either see it in real time or not, and then you can follow up. And maybe you can't shake hand, but you can shake a virtual hand. If you look at the YouTube counts of most neuroscience videos, I'm not talking about the big TEDx, TED Talks. I'm talking about most neuroscience and law lectures. They're in the tens or maybe hundreds. There are not a lot of folks investigated yet in this intersection. So it could mean something. If you write a personal note to someone that you've seen, hey, I really enjoyed your work. Do you have any opportunities? And then persevering again and again. Thought I'd show you this binder. I'm not going to open it up. You can read, it says, see, there it is, motivation. This is a binder that I keep of all the rejection letters I've had, and I have to have a ton more. But I've had tons of rejection letters, many more than acceptance letter. I've been turned down for hundreds of jobs and hundreds of opportunities over the years. And it's really a question, I think, of persevering again and again. All right, now let's talk specifically about law and neuroscience. So I would say first dabble a little bit. That is, there are the intersection of law and neuroscience means a lot of things. So to illustrate, here is, let's say you say, I'm kind of interested in law and brain injury. Which of the following sound the most or least appealing to you? I spend my days with brain injured patients, helping them to regain cognitive function. You could do that as an MD, as a PhD, as really a master's in counseling psychology. I spend my days with clients, preparing to go to court to do battle with insurance companies to get compensation for my clients with traumatic brain injury, practicing trial attorney. I spend my days studying current Veterans Administration policy related to compensation for brain injuries and write about how those policies can be improved. So another point to go to the question from Brian about policy is that you can work within an agency and you can sometimes have tremendous impact working within an agency. Could be at the federal level, could be at the state level, could even be at the local level. That can matter. You could be in an interest group that advocates again for those policies. All right, I spend my days designing and running rodent experiments to see how blasts affect brain circuitry. Really cool stuff. Maybe you want to be a bench neuroscientist. I spend my days teaching the basics of neurochemistry to undergraduate and graduate students. Maybe you just want to teach this stuff, which is great. We need awesome neuroscience teachers. I spend my days scanning the brains of former football players, studying the effect of football on dementia. Maybe you're doing work that's really at this intersection. Then we've come up with a list of 10 or 15 or 20 more of those. And again, my point is that you cannot do all of them. So, pick a little bit, think a little bit about them, what sounds, and maybe try a couple of them. All right. Then you have to at some point decide what your primary focus is going to be. I mentioned this before. It's a theme that I really want to emphasize tonight. You do not get to be primarily focused on science and law. You have to choose. You don't have to choose now, but at some point you have to choose. I chose law. I knew that I wanted to be in the law and policy sector, very engaged with neurosciences, very informed by neuroscience. But for me, it was in science and law. But for you, it might be something different. But at some point, you're going to have to decide what your focus is. All right. Once you decide what your focus is, then really look at individual pathways and make your own plan. What are the typical pathways and what are alternative pathways? Because maybe the typical pathway isn't available to you. And then how do you get on that path, right, from where I am now? And the importance of mentoring comes in here because they're going to help you figure this out. And then everything you can to get some relevant experience or education and make some relevant connections. And how do you do that? Very concrete advice. You go to where the people are. And in particular, why not go to a meeting or a conference where they're all going to be, or a talk where a bunch of them are going to be, and you can get a bunch of these folks at once. Experience or education. What sort of coursework should you be taking? Well, certainly a little bit in the relevant fields like neuroscience or AI, but it's really going to be in your graduate training where that picks up. You're going to have to produce, again, once you figure out your path, the sorts of things that are needed to get on your path. It is in law, you need to get into great law school, you need a great LSAT and you need great grades. For research, to get into a great PhD program, you have to show great signs of your research aptitude. So undergraduate research, and if you can get on a publication or two as co-author in a lab, that's really important, right? It really depends on which way you want to go. All right, so here are 3 specific challenges. Now, one is I cannot give you the single well-defined pathway or program that everyone goes through. I can't say, well, everyone who goes into law and neuroscience does this, because everyone who's gone into law and neuroscience so far has taken a different path. So you're just going to, if you want to go down this path, you just have to accept and embrace that you're going to be a trailblazer. Now, you can be a smart trailblazer. That's what I'm trying to say here, but you are going to be a trailblazer. Second, just know this, there are relatively few opportunities that are openly available. You're going to have to work to do research and practice in this field. You're making a bet on the future. And I'm going to encourage you at the end about why I think it's a good bet. But again, if you Google around, and many of you have, it's how you found this webinar probably, like, oh, I want to do internship in law and neuroscience. Well, there aren't a lot of them. There just aren't. That doesn't mean you can't create something that's going to serve that function. We'll get to that in a second, but I want to be realistic. I can't give you here a list of, oh, here are the 20 internships, as I could, for instance, internships in human rights, or internships in criminal justice, or internships in, iBanking, and so forth. All right, and then the third point is that pursuing interdisciplinary work is always difficult, okay? No matter what 2 fields you're putting together, it's especially difficult when the 2 fields that most of you are here wanting to pursue are really complicated, like law, which is very complex, or neuroscience and artificial intelligence, right? Both very complex. So embrace the challenge and persevere. All right, so where can you look for more information? And then we'll get to these questions that have shown up. So I'm going to give you a series of places. And again, we'll post the slides. It'll be posted, so you don't have to take notes furiously. I can't speak for what the current opportunities are at each of these places, but I can tell you that they're all good places with good people doing things that are related to law and neuroscience. I also should say this is not the universe of things. As I just mentioned, many agencies at the state and the local and especially the federal level are doing work that, depending on what you think about law and neuroscience, how you want to get involved, may be of interest. Moreover, and this goes back to the question of international work, these slides are U.S. domestic slides. Let me say a little bit more at the end about the international work, and there are slides that I can add to this. Okay, so as I mentioned before, LawNeuro.org at Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt also has a program in law and neuroscience, and has produced one and is producing their second JD PhD in neuroscience. It's a hub of law and neuroscience work. Professor Deborah Deno at Fordham University, Fordham Law School, runs a neuroscience and law center and does excellent work. So based in a law school, and runs a series of symposium in New York, Super Indian, New York. Check that out. Check out Columbia University. I don't have the slide for it here, but has a program in law and science, law and cognitive science. And there's a course in law and neuroscience being taught there. There's work at SUNY. I mean, there's a lot of going on in New York as well. If you're out on the West Coast, check out UCFF and UC Hastings Law School. They've got a wonderful consortium on law, science, and health policy, and they've done a lot of work in law and neuroscience. Stanford, also Northern California, they've got a wonderful program run by Professor Hank Greeley in collaboration with a lot of others on campus. Stanford University program in neuroscience and society, and there's sort of a program on law and ethics in there as well. Arizona State University, awesome work in law and science of all sorts, including law and neuroscience. Check it out if you're in the Southwest. Maybe you're in the South, on the other side, Southeast. Check out Duke, where Professor Nita Farahani and colleagues run an excellent law and neuroscience and generally law, science, and society program on ethics and law. If you're in the Northeast, but not in Boston or New York, check out the University of Pennsylvania Center for Neuroscience and Society. I was just there. These are tweets from last week, celebrating their 10th anniversary under Director Martha Farah, and wonderful neuroscience issues there, and many others. They do a lot of work, both on neuroscience and law, but neuroscience and ethics, neuroscience and public policy. One of the few degree granting programs in neuroscience and law, neuroscience and public policy is at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And they have had this program for just about 10 years now, a little over 10 years, I guess. And you can get a joint JD PhD or a joint MPP PhD in neuroscience, and they try and do a good job of then facilitating jobs, either in academics or in research and policy around these issues. There are also private groups. I'll just mention one under the direction of Kent Keel out in the Southwest, and you can check it out. Professor Keel, Dr. Keel is the lead innovator of mobile MRI on a truck, and he has done very neat research and is very involved in the legal system, and some of the work and the tools that they have developed are being used and they're brought in as consultants on a number of real-world legal cases. So and this isn't the only group like that, but I just give you one. Professor David Eagleman, Dr. David Eagleman out at Stanford, runs a Center for Science and Law. Maybe you know his books. He's had a popular series on PBS. He has a series on Netflix, and really at the intersection of popularizing neuroscience in a scientifically informed way. Georgetown, again in DC, Professor Jim Giordano runs a great program around ethics and law and health policy. Mention that. And there's so much more. So I don't have time to list, and it's probably not worthwhile to list every single person working in this area in every single center. Instead, what I want to do is show you this graph. This is a graph hosted at Vanderbilt at LawNeuro.org of the Law and Neuroscience bibliography. Many moons ago, over a decade ago, when I was just starting out as a postdoc, I helped create this bibliography, and it's continued to grow every year. On the x-axis down there is the year, and the y-axis, the cumulative number of law and neuroscience publications. And what you can see, as I mentioned before, is that almost all the action is in the last 10 years. That means there are thousands of people who have written on some aspect of law and neuroscience, and it undercounts, in particular, probably undercounts some of the non-English language work. So that means there are thousands of people who could be your mentor or with whom you could do some research. So just because there isn't a program at a university called Research Internship in Law and Neuroscience doesn't mean that there's not necessarily an opportunity for you. It does mean, as I said before, you've got to be a trailblazer. You have to have the boldness to approach a professor, and you have to think a little bit about what it is you want to do. You know, do you want to work on sports concussions? Do you want to work on Alzheimer's? Do you want to work on brain-machine interface and new technology? You know, where does your passion lie? And then go find those people. Go to the bibliography. Check out who's writing on it. Go to the patent office. See who's search the patents. Search the neuroscience literature. And see if there's a way for you to get involved. Okay, and of course, I just mentioned our own work. We run, I have all kinds of students in my lab, probably more than we can handle right now, but we're always around. And the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior is actually hiring right now. We just posted on MGH for term time for those who are in Boston. And then we'll be hiring in the coming years as we expand as well. Our program is, I think, a really neat mix of research on the one hand, but also very applied work. And we are affiliated with Harvard Medical School and with Harvard Law School, the Patriot Sloan Center. Again, our idea is better better decisions aligned with science are going to give us hopefully better outcomes aligned with justice. And we're really focusing on, I just think some key areas, and I think we're at the cutting edge. So we're doing a lot of good stuff there. All right, answering your questions. You have them, here they are. So let me just check my time 1 second, make sure that we don't go over. We're right on time, great. So about 10 minutes for questions, say a few minutes later if you need to. So Chris, thank you for your question. Joining from Australia, currently undertaking any partnerships with Australian academics for the Australian legal community. So a couple of things, not quite, I just met with a group, so there is an active group in Australia and New Zealand, more than one active group. What I will do is make a note to add to the slide deck some of those links, because I don't know the URLs offhand, but I can tell you that I've worked with them, some of those individuals, I've met with some of them, and they're doing neat work. And I've known it in the context of criminal responsibility, in the context of brain-based memory detection using EEG and electroencephalography, and in the context of sports concussions around rugby. So, and a bit of football. So the answer is yes, and I will add some slides to this. Good questions. Let me say that I've hopefully answered that. Next, Brian, your question, right? So the sort of regulation on neurotech. This is a real challenge. FDA is probably the first place to go. Congress is wrestling with this right now. FDA, Congress is trying to figure out how do we handle AI. And the short answer is we don't know, because again, in short and oversimplifying, products have never changed day to day, right? I mean, you approve the product and you have ongoing monitoring, but the product on Tuesday looks different maybe than the product on Wednesday because you have these self-learning mechanisms involved. And it's really causing some challenges. NIH has a working group, ACD working group. So it's that's like assistant to the director working group on AI right now. I can add some of those slides as well, just sort of noting that those people on that working group come from all areas. Some of them are neuroscientists. So one way to get involved in policy is become an awesome neuroscientist or awesome engineer in your area of specialty, and then keep in mind that you care about ethics or law. That's a really tried and true path, because you need ethically informed and legal informed scientists at the table. That's one way. Another way to go is you become a regulator who knows the ins and outs of FDA law, left, right, and center, but also has an understanding of some of the relevant science. This goes back to my point before. You can't do both. Right? You're going to spend your days designing awesome robots and then also participate in the ethics discussion. Or are you going to spend your days trying to get regulation right, but also spend some of your time going to conferences to keep up with the science? Both great ways to go, and there are some options. Are there particular values or drawbacks to doing a combined degree program starting with just one? Okay, Heather, great question. You'll get different answers, but I think all of the answers will emphasize the following things. One question is, why do you want to do the degree, and do you need both degrees? For very few, if any of the professions that I've mentioned, the pathways, do you absolutely need both the credential degrees. For some, it can certainly help. Some of that expert witnessing can help. For my own research, I wanted to have the quantitative still. So I crunch a bunch of numbers. I wanted that. But do most law professors have PhDs? No. Do most neuroscientists have JDs? No. Hardly any have them. So you don't need them. And the major drawback of doing a dual degree is time. It takes so much time out of the prime years of some of the prime years of your productivity. Before, I've got 2 kids, 5 and 7. Before you have your kids, you have everything else, life gets busy. You're just in those prime years, and are you spending them doing just one thing or being split between 2 things? And so it's a primary drawback is the time and also the cost involved as well. I will say that so you'll get different answers on whether or not it makes sense to do a dual degree. It's really a very individual decision. Many do them. They're increasing in number. It is the case that for law professoring, I think it can be an advantage sometimes, depending, again, on the integration. And to make sure, again, that even if you do a joint degree, they're joint, but they're not equal partners. Because at the end of the day, at the end of that joint degree, you will have to, or really not at the end, at some point in the middle of that joint degree, you're going to have to make a decision. Do I really want to get one more scientific publication, or do I want to get one more law publication? Or if I'm going into industry, Do I want to be really doing my internships, with a science firm or with a legal firm, right? You don't get to do both all the time. You should dabble. You can and you should dabble, as I said before, but at some point you'll have to make your decision. So a great question. I hope not too amorphous of an answer, because it is an individual decision, but there are drawbacks and some bonuses to doing both. Now, related to that question, I will emphasize that I think everyone would say the quality of the program matters more so than the degree itself. That is, all PhDs are not equal and all JDs are not equal. There are MD is sort of a separate category. I would say, because the reason MD is different from JD and PhD is that if you try hard enough, well, you can get into a PhD program, and you don't even have to try very hard to get into a JD program, because JD programs, as you go further down the ranks of law schools, are pay to play. You got enough money for tuition, you can go to that law school. And I'm sure anyone in this webinar could get into a law school. It's much more difficult to get into MD to medical school because of the barriers to entry. So that's a little bit different of an animal. But it is really important to get to the highest quality program you can, which means, this is why it kind of goes to the backtrack. Boy, if you decide really later in your kind of pathway that, oh, I really want to go to do a PhD in neuroscience, but you didn't, that was kind of a new thing. Do you have the requisite research skills and the research track record in neuroscience? Well, no, because for the longest time you thought you wanted to do labor and employment law, right? So those pathways can matter for the quality of the program. So I'd say really put a lot of emphasis on the quality of the program. It's a sort of a separate discussion. Well, I should say it now. How do you get into those programs? On the research side, this gets to the next question: what are the most critical benefits that a mentor can provide? So some of them are substantive, like how do you actually learn the material? It depends who your teacher is. And just think about any sort of skill you've acquired, from riding a bike to swimming, to reading critically. Some of your teachers and your mentors have been really good, and after listening to them and engaging with them, you're really able to do the thing you wanted to do. And others, like this, I have no idea what you just told me, or it's not clicking for me. So one of the really important things, they can just help you learn the material. It's really important in a PhD program. It's important in law school too, actually. Though often in law, sometimes your mentor will be a practicing attorney. How are you going to be a great trial attorney? By being around other great trial attorneys. So that's one really important benefit. The other equally important benefit is networking. You don't have a network until you have mentors, because your mentors are going to provide you with their network. That's part of mentoring. And by providing you with their network, I mean going to bat for you and helping you get into programs through formal recommendation letters and phone calls, helping you get jobs by calling their friends and networks and trying to get you jobs. And I can tell you on the hiring side that it makes a tremendous difference if I get a cold email from, John Q. Public, says, "Dear Professor Shen, I'm really interested in law and neuroscience. Do you have any openings in your lab, or, can we talk? I'm so busy now, I don't often have time." But if that person says, "Dear Professor Shen, I just had coffee with my mentor," and then insert name of someone who's really close to me and is a good friend of mine and who has also done a lot of work for me, over the years, and he or she suggested I contact you, my response will be different. And that's a very honest response from me, and that's what you'll experience. So it helps you, being allowed to use their name opens up doors, and they'll just know who to contact, right? So you can go to them and you can say, here's who you contact. So for instance, on this Australian question up here, because I can give you some names of people that I've met with, because I've just happened to be in that neighborhood. And the more mentors and the more network opportunities you have, great, you can go to find more people. So I'd say both the substance and the networking are really important for mentoring. And then a final portion of that is just the sort of emotional and encouragement support. It is really a challenging road in some ways, that I've just laid out, right? And you need a lot of encouragement along the way. It is a really tough thing to put your writing out there or your research out there and have others critique it. And someone who can give you feedback and help you and, make you feel like, boy, you might be able to do this is really important. And it's the same thing, again, if you've had any of your best teachers, hopefully they've both challenged you, but also made you feel, yeah, I can actually do this. So I'd say those are mentoring. Now, if most of the centers are non-degree granting, how does one get involved in them? Okay, so that's a good question. Now, a challenge is that a lot of these centers that I mentioned, the others in our field, are small. There are larger organizations, but one way to get involved is to try and find a way to get to see just what their institutional structure looks like. Is there a way to either do they have fellowships, internships? Are there open staff positions where you're not actually in some ways doing the substance of the work, but you're really around it in ways that allow you to sort of get into it? And by way of discussion, I and a lot of my colleagues, even when we were doing our postdocs, I'm doing a lot of things, and even now, like at times, ordering the coffee for meetings, which you think, wait a second, I just got all these degrees and I spent all this money to get a college degree, and now I'm, spending my time arranging meetings. That is one of the best ways to meet people, or handling reimbursements, because you just get to meet people as people. And then it turns out 3 years later, you realize, boy, the person who I got that coffee for turns out to be one of the world's smartest neuroscientists, and I know that person, and they're willing to engage with me. So certainly having affiliation with the school helps if you're trying to get connected with the center. If you don't have an affiliation with the school, first to see if there are any openings, and the second is just kind of keep hanging around, either electronically if you're in the distance, or kind of close by physically if you're there. And I will say that often doesn't always work, but it can often open doors, just because persistence, so long as it's professional and not overbearing, I think can work potentially. And then state and local level. Yeah, so I would say at the state and local level, you're going to look, it really varies a lot by state and locality, but you're going to typically gravitate towards things like a health and human services group, criminal justice group, if that's your area, and then sort of public health initiatives, places where medicine and science are meeting policy and law already, and of which there are many. This goes back to the substance of neuroscience and law. So work that's around addiction. Every locality and every state is trying to handle substance use disorder and mental health. I mean, it's there. Every state and many of the larger localities are trying to, for instance, handle the challenge of returning veterans, or issues around suicide, issues around violence, issues around hate, issues around racism. Those are brain questions. How do you intervene? It's not the same as, oh, let me try and find a place that's doing brain-based lie detection and get involved. You won't find that. But if you broaden back a step and think about, why is it that I'm interested in the way that the brain functions? What are the big questions I care about? And what do I want the world, how do I want to contribute to making the world a little bit of a better place? I think you can begin to see some of those intersections. So I would say, again, at the state and local level, your health and human services, your criminal justice, your even like insurance law. I met with in our state, I've met with the insurance representatives who have to handle policy around insurance provisions, health insurance provisions around mental illness, mental disorder. Well, that matters. And those are in many ways both brain and law questions. But, that varies a lot from regulating direct-to-consumer electrical stimulation technology to the FDA. So the big point here, a lot of options, depends on what you want to do. And then the last question is, do I have any initiatives at community college? So I do not directly have any, but I do know that there are a number of community colleges interested in some of the things that I just mentioned. So filtering a lot into criminal justice work, filtering a lot into work in the community around substance use disorder and related challenges. And so I think you kind of have to back in a little bit and try and connect some of those things. I'm sorry, I don't have like a go-to list of places, but I would say that that's maybe a place I'd start it and just sort of look at the professors who seem to be involved in that. And even if the word brain is not being used, it doesn't mean it's not neuroscience and law. So to throw in just a little bit of the substance before I take the last question and we wrap up, at present, one of the reasons neuroscience and law is just beginning to show up is that neuroscience is not yet really, at least in terms of looking at biomarker data, brain data, isn't a big part of our mental disorder definitions or diagnosis or treatment. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that with the notable exception and important exception of pharmacology, that is providing certain pharmacological responses to certain mental illnesses and mental disorders, we don't use biomarker data to define or diagnose mental disorders. The DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Medical Association, is based on symptoms. What you should know is that at the research level, that's that paradigm is really being challenged in important and I think good ways, so that we approach mental disorders like the brain circuitry disorders they are, and we approach it a lot more like we approach, say, cancer. It will, I think, reduce the stigma. It will change the way we talk about it. Remember last time someone in your class in grade school had a broken bone, broken arm? They came in with the cast, and everybody, it sucked that she had a broken arm, but everybody signed it, and there was no shame in it. I doubt anyone came into your class and announced, hey, you know what? I've got a brain challenge, and I have this mental illness. I was just diagnosed. No, they probably tried to hide it for the longest time. So just the way we think about those things will vary. Getting back to your question, you might not see the word brain and law initiative at many schools, and not just community colleges, just many universities and even just many policy areas. But if you see the words substance use disorder, addiction, suicide, depression, dementia, you should know, and if you're on this webinar, you surely know, those are all brain questions. And the research is rapidly, if haltingly and sometimes frustratingly slowly progressing. In my mind, that's again going back to my very first question, why it makes sense to be in this field, because those brain questions are really with us. The brain questions that are in the headlines today, why did those individuals who in Texas and Ohio shoot? Why have others done that? What was going on inside their brains? Those are brain and law questions as well. Thorny, complicated, politically fraught, but eventually I think brain science will have something to say. So I'm sorry I don't have anything specific, but I'd say generally to encourage you to look for those connections. And it looks like Chris has already started a Facebook group, so this is great. My RAs, and some of you are listening, I'll say they know that I am technically advanced, but socially media very limited. So I don't know anything about those worlds, but I'm glad that you're out there. And I hope that actually our center, with the help of thank you student interns and RAs, will help me pick up the social media side of things. And I really would, if you can, keep your eyes on the CLBB. I think we're going to be doing a lot of great things. And one of the things we do hope to do is build a community and to build opportunities more formal and sustaining. You heard it here first. I'm trying to get funding for what would be an annual Essential Academy for us to talk about this instead of 1 hour webinar, for you to come to Boston and spend a few days with us, hearing from the best and brightest, getting excited, meeting each other, and really then you planting these seeds out there. It's a better in the future, and you're going to be defining it. So that's it. That's it for those of you who have been listening. Thanks for attending, especially those for asking questions. For those of you who, I'll stop sharing my screen now. For those of you who have been just watching later at home, thanks for watching. Again, my name is Francis Shen. This is brought to you by my lab, the Shen Neuro Law Lab, and also the Harvard MGH Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. You can find my contact information there. I'm easy to track down. So do the networking and come, hang out with us sometime in Boston. We are accepting applications now. I'll say in advance, we have limited capacity to mentor, but we hope to expand that in the future. So thanks so much. Have a great night, and ask questions if you have them. Take care. Bye-bye.